A human warship crossed the border. The Empire froze in fear. The klaxon screamed through the bridge of the hegemony's wrath like the death cries of a wounded beast. Fleet Admiral Kalen Vorthak's crystalline carapace shifted from deep blue to violent crimson as stress hormones flooded his system. His compound eyes, each the size of a human fist, focused on the tactical display where a single white dot had appeared at the edge of Nexus Prime's defensive perimeter. "Report!" His voice boomed through the command center, each word vibrating through the metal deck plates. The Zephyrian's forearms moved in agitated patterns as he studied the holographic display showing the most heavily fortified system in the galactic hegemony. Sub-Commander Thijs Korvac, her serpentine form coiled around her command console, raised her scaled head with barely concealed panic. "Admiral, we have an unidentified vessel that just dropped out of hyperspace at coordinates 77 Mark 12. It appeared without any gravitational distortion warnings." Vorthak's primary eyes narrowed to slits. In his 200 years of military service, he had never encountered a ship that could exit hyperspace without the telltale energy signatures that preceded such jumps. It was impossible. The laws of physics demanded that mass displacement create detectable ripples in space-time. "Show me the vessel," he commanded, his secondary arms gripping the command rail so tightly that the metal began to groan under the pressure. The main view screen flickered and displayed an image that made every officer on the bridge fall silent. The ship was unlike anything in the hegemony's extensive databases. Roughly 2 kilometers in length, it possessed a sleek, predatory design that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Strange geometric patterns ran along its hull like glowing veins, pulsing with an energy that registered on no known scanner frequency. "Run it through the identification matrix," Vorthak ordered, though something deep in his genetic memory was already whispering warnings that made his exoskeleton itch. Lieutenant Nexus Dravox, a young Altarian with silver skin that reflected his nervousness, worked frantically at his console. His 6-fingered hands danced across holographic interfaces as databases from across the galaxy were queried. Minutes passed in tense silence before he looked up with confusion etched across his features. "Sir, there's no match in any of our records. This ship design doesn't exist in our current databases, but..." He paused, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But it's triggering alerts in the historical archives." "Historical archives?" Vorthak's voice carried a dangerous edge. "Explain." Dravox's skin shifted to a pale silver that indicated extreme stress. "The computer is flagging similarities to vessel configurations from the Old War period, specifically from the species designation Terran." The word hit the bridge like a physical blow. Every officer present had learned about the Terrans in their military academies, but only as a cautionary tale from ancient history. The humans had been the galaxy's greatest threat over 8 centuries ago, before the hegemony had united every major species to drive them beyond the galactic rim. "That's impossible," Sub-Commander Korvac hissed, her forked tongue tasting the fear sense that now filled the bridge's atmosphere. "The Terrans were eliminated during the Great Purge. Our ancestors made sure of that." But even as she spoke, long-buried genetic memories began surfacing. Stories passed down through generations spoke of a species that refused to submit, that fought with a ferocity that bordered on madness, and that had developed weapons of unimaginable destruction before they were finally driven into the void. On the bridge of the unknown vessel, Captain Zara Blackwood stood with the calm confidence of someone who had spent the last decade planning for this exact moment. Her steel-gray eyes surveyed the massive fleet arrayed before them through the main viewport, counting at least 40 dreadnoughts, countless cruisers, and defensive stations that bristled with enough firepower to crack planets. "Tactical assessment, Commander Pike," she said to the tall, lean man seated at the weapons console. Commander Riker Pike had spent his entire adult life studying hegemony military doctrine, preparing for the day when humanity would return to claim what was rightfully theirs. "Impressive display, Captain," Pike replied, his voice carrying the slight accent of someone born in the outer colonies. 43 capital ships, roughly 200 escort vessels, and 12 orbital defense platforms. They're running a standard defensive formation, circa 800 GSC, outdated but still formidable by their standards. Dr. Nova Reeves looked up from her science station, her brilliant blue eyes bright with excitement. The xenobiologist had been analyzing hegemony transmissions for years, preparing for this moment of contact. Captain, their communication patterns indicate extreme agitation. Heart rate equivalents are spiking across all vessels. They know what they're looking at, even if they don't want to believe it. Blackwood nodded. The psychological impact was crucial to their mission. Fear was often more effective than weapons, and humanity had learned to wield both with devastating efficiency. Commander Torres, she addressed the ship's communication officer, a woman whose cybernetic implants allowed her to monitor dozens of frequencies simultaneously. Are you receiving their chatter? Kira Torres' augmented eyes flickered as data streams flowed directly into her neural processors. Affirmative, Captain. They're using quantum encrypted channels, but our codebreakers cracked their protocols years ago. The fleet commander is requesting immediate reinforcements and has placed all ships on maximum alert. Good, Blackwood smiled, though there was no warmth in it. Let them sweat for a few more minutes. I want their imaginations to work overtime before we make contact. Meanwhile, in the depths of the hegemony capital ship, Admiral Vorthak was experiencing what could only be described as a panic attack. His species had evolved from apex predators, but they had also inherited an instinctual understanding of when they encountered something higher on the food chain. Sir, Lieutenant Drevos called out, his voice cracking with strain. I've completed the historical database search. The last recorded Terran vessel was destroyed at the Battle of Proxima Centauri in 2387. Their entire fleet was eliminated, and their homeworld was cleansed. Vorthak felt his internal temperature drop several degrees. The Battle of Proxima Centauri was legendary in hegemony military history, not because of its strategic importance, but because of how brutally it had been fought. The humans had refused to surrender even when facing annihilation, fighting ship to ship, deck by deck, and hand to hand until the very last of them was dead. Then what is that ship? He demanded, gesturing at the view screen where the mysterious vessel continued to hang in space like a predator choosing its moment to strike. Before anyone could answer, every communication array in the fleet suddenly activated simultaneously. The unknown ship was broadcasting on all frequencies, overriding every security protocol and encryption system as if they didn't exist. Attention, vessels of the Galactic hegemony. A clear, strong voice echoed through every bridge in the system. This is Captain Zara Blackwood of the Terran Confederation vessel Retribution. I'm sure our presence here comes as something of a surprise. On his command deck, Vorthak felt his legs threatening to give out beneath him. The voice was speaking perfect galactic standard, but with inflections and tonal patterns that hadn't been heard in 800 years. It was unmistakably human. That's impossible, Sub-Commander Korvac whispered, her serpentine body coiling tighter around her console. The humans are extinct. We made certain of that. Captain Blackwood's voice continued, and there was an edge to it that made every officer in the fleet unconsciously check their weapon systems. I'm afraid your history books have been somewhat optimistic in their reporting. While it's true that you succeeded in driving us from our home systems, humanity has a rather annoying habit of surviving things that should kill us. Admiral Vorthak activated his communication system with one of his trembling secondary arms. This is Fleet Admiral Kalen Vorthak of the Hegemony Defense Force. Identify yourself and state your intentions. This is Hegemony space, and you are in violation of our territorial boundaries. The laugh that came back over the communication channel was like ice water in the veins of every alien officer listening. Admiral Vorthak, what an honor to speak with such a distinguished military leader. I've read about your victories at Altair 7 and the Cygnus campaign. Very impressive work, slaughtering all those defenseless colonies. Vorthak's carapace flushed a deeper red. Those campaigns were considered great victories in hegemony history, the final subjugation of the last independent species in this arm of the galaxy. But something in the human's tone suggested a very different perspective on those events. Those were legitimate military operations against hostile forces, he replied, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. Hostile forces, Blackwood repeated thoughtfully. Is that what you call agricultural colonies and research stations? How very martial of you, Admiral. Tell me, how many of those hostile forces were actually armed? The question hung in space like an accusation. Everyone in the fleet knew the answer, even if they had never spoken it aloud. The Altarians had been peaceful traders. The Signoids had been artists and philosophers. Neither species had possessed military forces capable of threatening even a single hegemony corvette. "We're not here to debate ancient history," Vorthak said, trying to regain control of the conversation. "State your business and prepare to be escorted out of hegemony space." "Oh, but Admiral," Blackwood's voice carried an undercurrent of dark amusement. "This is very much about ancient history. You see, we humans have excellent memories. We remember every world you burned, every ship you destroyed, every life you took. We've had 800 years to remember." On the bridge of the Retribution, Dr. Reeves was monitoring the psychological impact of their words through advanced sensors that could detect stress hormones across multiple species. "Captain, their biometric readings are off the charts. Several vessels are showing signs of crew panic." "Excellent," Blackwood replied. "Commander Pike, begin the demonstration. Let's show them what we learned during our time in exile." Pike's fingers moved across his console with practiced precision. "Initiating Phase 1, Captain. Stealth systems online." What happened next violated everything the hegemony thought they knew about physics and warfare. The human ship didn't disappear from their sensors. It simply became impossible to target. Every weapon system in the fleet suddenly found itself unable to lock onto the vessel, despite the fact that it remained clearly visible on all optical displays. "What's happening to our targeting computers?" Vorthak roared, his forearms gesticulating wildly as he tried to make sense of the tactical displays. Lieutenant Drevox was frantically running diagnostics on every system. "Sir, all weapons arrays are functioning normally, but they cannot establish target lock. It's as if the enemy vessel exists in a quantum state that our sensors cannot properly resolve." Commander Torres' voice crackled over the Retribution's communication system. "Captain, I'm detecting massive spikes in their communication traffic. They're requesting immediate reinforcements from the hegemony core worlds." "How immediate?" Blackwood asked. "They're using priority alpha channels. I'd estimate 12 hours before significant reinforcements arrive." Blackwood nodded. "More than enough time. Dr. Reeves, begin the psychological profiling. I want to know exactly how terrified they are." Nova Reeves's instruments were recording unprecedented data. "Captain, their fear responses are overwhelming their logical processes. Several species in that fleet are showing signs of genetic memory activation, deep, evolutionary terror responses that suggest their ancestors remembered us even after 8 centuries. It was true. Across the hegemony fleet, officers were experiencing something beyond mere fear. Their genetic codes carried embedded memories of humanity's last war against the galaxy, memories of a species that had fought with such ferocity that it had required the combined might of dozens of civilizations to finally drive them into exile. "Admiral!" Sub-Commander Korvac hissed, her scales rippling with patterns that indicated extreme distress. "We should withdraw and regroup. This single vessel has already demonstrated capabilities we cannot counter." Vorthak wanted to agree, but his military training warred with his survival instincts. "We cannot retreat from one ship. The Hegemony Council would have us executed for cowardice." "Better executed than extinct," Korvac replied grimly. Captain Blackwood's voice filled the communication channels once again. "Admiral Vorthak, I can sense your dilemma. Military pride demands that you engage us, but your instincts are telling you that would be a fatal mistake. Allow me to help you make that decision." On the Retribution's bridge, Commander Pike looked up from his weapons console. "Captain, shall I demonstrate our offensive capabilities?" "Not yet, Commander. Let's show them something even more terrifying, our restraint." Blackwood activated the ship's external communication array. "Admiral, I want you to understand something very important. We're not here to start a war, we're here to finish one." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. 800 years ago, your predecessors drove humanity from our home systems. You burned our colonies, destroyed our fleets, and scattered our people to the darkest corners of the galaxy. You thought you had solved the human problem permanently. Admiral Vorthak found himself leaning forward despite his fear, compelled by something in the human captain's voice. But you made one critical error in your calculations, Admiral. You assumed that exile would break us, that being driven from our homes would destroy our will to fight. Instead, it did something far more dangerous. It gave us time to evolve. Dr. Reeves began broadcasting detailed sensor data on all frequencies, information that made every science officer in the Hegemony fleet stare at their screens in disbelief. The human ship was generating energy readings that shouldn't have been possible. Its hull was composed of materials that didn't exist in any known periodic table, and its engine signatures suggested propulsion technology that was centuries ahead of anything the Hegemony possessed. For 8 centuries, Blackwood continued, humanity has wandered the void between galaxies. We've discovered technologies you cannot imagine, formed alliances with species you've never encountered, and built a civilization that spans dimensions you don't even know exist. Lieutenant Dravox looked up from his science console, his silver skin now completely pale with shock. Admiral, their ship is generating readings consistent with matter manipulation at the quantum level. They're literally rewriting the laws of physics around their vessel. The implications were staggering. If humanity had mastered quantum manipulation, they could potentially alter matter at the subatomic level, create energy from nothing, and bend space-time itself to their will. You're lying, Vorthak said, though his voice lacked conviction. No species could develop such technology. Desperation is a powerful motivator, Admiral, Blackwood replied. When your entire species faces extinction, you tend to become very creative very quickly. We've had 800 years of desperation driving our innovation. Commander Torres reported from her station. Captain, I'm detecting quantum entanglement signatures. They're communicating with something outside this galaxy. The fleet, Blackwood confirmed. Admiral Vorthak, you should know that the Retribution is not alone. We're the advanced scout for humanity's return to the galaxy. Even now, our main battle groups are positioning themselves at strategic points throughout Hegemony space. She activated a holographic display that showed the entire galactic map. Red dots began appearing at critical systems throughout the Hegemony military bases, industrial centers, and population hubs. There were hundreds of them. Each of those dots represents a human vessel currently in position and awaiting orders, Blackwood explained calmly. Unlike your fleet, which requires hours to coordinate movement between systems, our ships are connected through quantum entanglement networks. We can communicate and coordinate instantaneously across any distance. Admiral Vorthak stared at the display with growing horror. If the human was telling the truth, the Hegemony was already surrounded and outgunned by an enemy they couldn't even detect until it was too late. This is impossible, he whispered. Our long-range sensors would have detected such a massive fleet movement. Would they? Dr. Reeves interjected, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades studying alien technology. Your sensors are designed to detect ships using conventional propulsion and traditional materials. We're using neither. She began transmitting technical data that made every engineer in the Hegemony fleet question everything they thought they knew about starship design. The humans had apparently developed vessels that existed partially outside normal space-time, making them undetectable to conventional sensors until they chose to reveal themselves. 800 years ago, Blackwood continued, humanity was young and naive. We believed in honor in warfare, in the protection of civilians, in the rules of engagement that supposedly govern civilized species. Your ancestors taught us that such idealism was a luxury we couldn't afford. Her voice hardened, taking on an edge that made hardened military veterans unconsciously step back from their communication consoles. So we learned. We became what you forced us to become. We mastered technologies that your greatest scientists dismiss as impossible. We formed alliances with entities that exist beyond your comprehension. We became something that could survive in a galaxy that wanted us dead. Commander Pike looked up from his tactical station. Captain, I'm detecting multiple hyperspace signatures. Hegemony reinforcements are arriving ahead of schedule. How many ships? Blackwood asked. 16 dreadnoughts, 47 cruisers, and approximately 200 escort vessels. Admiral Courthax is commanding from the Super Dreadnought Galactic Supremacy. Blackwood smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. Admiral Courthax. Now there's a name that appears frequently in our historical records. The Butcher of Rigel, the architect of the Vega massacres. How fitting. Admiral Vorthak felt a chill run through his carapace. Admiral Kortax was legendary throughout the Hegemony military, a tactical genius known for his ruthless efficiency and his willingness to sacrifice entire populations to achieve strategic objectives. If anyone could handle this crisis, it would be him. The massive super-dreadnought Galactic supremacy emerged from hyperspace with all the subtle grace of a falling mountain. At 12 kilometers in length and armed with weapons that could sterilize continents, it represented the absolute pinnacle of hegemony military technology. The ship was accompanied by a fleet that could have conquered entire star systems. "This is Admiral Kortax of the Hegemony Supreme Command," a voice like grinding stone announced across all frequencies. "Unknown vessel, you are ordered to surrender immediately or face annihilation. You have 60 seconds to comply." On the bridge of the Retribution, the human crew exchanged glances that mixed anticipation with grim satisfaction. They had been waiting their entire lives for this moment, the confrontation between humanity's children and the species that had tried to erase them from existence. "Admiral Kortax," Captain Blackwood replied, her voice carrying no trace of fear or submission. "Your reputation precedes you. I've read the reports about your campaigns against defenseless colonies. Very inspiring work for anyone studying the methodology of genocide. You will address me with proper respect, human," Kortax snarled, his voice betraying the first hint of surprise. He had not expected the unknown vessel to identify him, much less know details about his military history. "Respect?" Blackwood's laugh was like breaking glass. "Admiral, respect is earned through honorable action. Your record suggests you wouldn't recognize honor if it introduced itself at a formal dinner." The insult hit Kortax like a physical blow. In 8 centuries of military service, no one had dared speak to him with such casual contempt. His response was predictably violent. "All ships, open fire. Destroy that vessel immediately." What followed was a display of firepower that would have reduced most civilizations to ash and memory. The combined fleet unleashed enough destructive energy to crack moons, focusing it all on the single human ship that hung motionless in space. For 30 seconds, the space around the Retribution burned with energies that registered on sensors throughout the system. When the barrage finally ended, every alien in the fleet expected to see nothing but expanding debris and cooling plasma. Instead, the human ship remained exactly where it had been, completely undamaged and apparently unaffected by the most concentrated weapons fire in hegemony history. "Impressive light show," Captain Blackwood commented calmly. "We particularly enjoyed the quantum torpedo barrage, very creative use of exotic matter. However, I think it's time we demonstrated why exile made us stronger rather than weaker." Commander Pike activated systems that existed beyond the understanding of hegemony science. "Captain, temporal displacement field is active. All enemy weapons fire is being redirected to alternate timeline iterations of this battle." The explanation was barely comprehensible to the listening aliens, but the implications were terrifying. The humans had somehow learned to manipulate time itself, redirecting attacks into alternate versions of reality where the battle played out differently. "That's impossible," Admiral Kortax roared over the communication channels. "Nothing can alter the flow of time." "Nothing that you understand," Dr. Reeves corrected. "But then your understanding has always been somewhat limited, hasn't it? After all, you thought genocide was a viable solution to political disagreement." She began broadcasting historical data that made every alien in the fleet confront uncomfortable truths about their civilization's past. The records showed the systematic extermination of dozens of species, the destruction of entire cultures, and the ruthless expansion of hegemony control throughout the galaxy. "For 800 years, Captain Blackwood continued, the hegemony has told itself that the elimination of humanity was necessary for galactic peace. You've convinced yourselves that we were a threat to civilized society." Her voice grew colder with each word. "But your own records tell a different story. They show that humanity's only crime was refusing to submit to hegemony authority. We wouldn't kneel, so you decided we had to die." Admiral Vorthak found himself unable to respond. The historical records were clear. Humanity had been one of many species that had resisted hegemony expansion. But they had been singled out for complete extinction not because they were more dangerous than others, but because they had been more successful at fighting back. You made us into what we are today, Blackwood continued relentlessly. Every atrocity you committed against our people, every world you burned, every ship you destroyed, all of it served to forge us into something capable of surviving in a hostile galaxy. She paused, allowing her words to sink in before delivering the final psychological blow. And now we've come home. Commander Torres looked up from her communication station. Captain, I'm detecting panic communications throughout their fleet. Several ships are requesting permission to withdraw from the system. Denied, Admiral Cortex snarled over the communication channels. No hegemony vessel will retreat before a single enemy ship, regardless of their apparent capabilities. But his words couldn't disguise the fear that was spreading through his fleet like a contagion. Officers who had spent their entire careers believing in hegemony military supremacy were confronting the reality that they faced an enemy completely beyond their understanding. Captain Blackwood activated the ship's external scanners, broadcasting detailed analysis of every vessel in the hegemony fleet. The data revealed structural weaknesses, weapon limitations, and tactical vulnerabilities that no alien captain wanted their enemies to possess. Admiral Cortex, she said conversationally, your flagship has a fascinating design flaw in its primary reactor shielding. A precisely targeted quantum pulse at the right frequency could cause a cascading failure that would turn your entire ship into a rather spectacular supernova. Cortex felt his blood freeze as his engineering teams confirmed that the human assessment was accurate. Somehow, in the space of minutes, they had completely analyzed the most advanced warship in the hegemony fleet and identified a critical vulnerability that had been classified at the highest levels. How do you know about our ship specifications? He demanded. We've been watching you for 800 years, Dr. Reeves replied matter-of-factly. Did you really think we spent all that time hiding in exile without learning everything there was to know about our enemies? She began broadcasting technical schematics of every major hegemony ship class, complete with detailed analyses of their weaknesses and suggested methods for their destruction. The information was so comprehensive and accurate that several fleet commanders began wondering if they had spies among their own crews. This is psychological warfare, Admiral Vorthak said, though his voice lacked conviction. You're trying to demoralize us with false information. False information? Commander Pike interjected. Would you like us to demonstrate the accuracy of our intelligence? I could disable your weapon systems without destroying your ship, just to prove we know exactly how they function. Before any of the alien commanders could respond, the Retribution fired a single, precisely targeted energy pulse. The beam struck Admiral Vorthak's flagship at what appeared to be a random point on the hull, but within seconds, every weapon system on the massive dreadnought went offline simultaneously. Impressive, Captain Blackwood commented. Commander Pike, your targeting was perfect. Admiral Vorthak, you'll find that your weapons will come back online in approximately 10 minutes. Consider this a demonstration of our restraint rather than our capabilities. The psychological impact was devastating. The humans had just proven that they could disable any ship in the hegemony fleet at will, and they had chosen to demonstrate their mercy rather than their destructive power. What do you want? Admiral Cortex finally asked, his voice heavy with the weight of defeat. Justice, Blackwood replied simply. 800 years of it. She activated the ship's holographic projectors, filling the space between the fleets with images that made every alien present confront the reality of their civilization's history. The holograph showed the systematic destruction of human colonies, the mass execution of prisoners, and the deliberate targeting of civilian populations during the Great Purge. These are your ancestors' greatest victories, Blackwood said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Every image is taken from your own historical archives. This is what the hegemony considers military glory. Admiral Vorthak stared at the images with growing horror. He had learned about the Great Purge and Military Academy, but it had always been presented as a necessary campaign against a dangerous enemy. The reality was far more brutal and far less justifiable than the sanitized version he had been taught. The galaxy has lived in peace because you eliminated us, Blackwood continued, but peace built on genocide is not peace. It's merely delayed justice. Dr. Reeves began broadcasting population statistics that made the scope of the historical atrocity clear. 17 billion humans lived in this galaxy when your ancestors began their campaign of extermination. Less than 50 million survived to escape into exile. The numbers were staggering. The hegemony had succeeded in killing more than 99% of the human population, making it one of the most successful genocides in galactic history. "We are the children of those 50 million survivors," Captain Blackwood said, her voice carrying the weight of 8 centuries of grief and anger. "We carry their memories, their pain, and their promise that humanity would return to claim justice for what was done to us." Commander Torres looked up from her station. "Captain, I'm detecting quantum signatures consistent with fleet movement. Our people are taking positions throughout hegemony space." "How many ships?" Admiral Cortax asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "All of them," Blackwood replied simply. "Every human vessel that survived the Exodus, every ship we've built during our exile, every ally we've recruited along the way. The entire Terran Confederation fleet is now positioned within striking distance of every major hegemony system." She activated the galactic display again, but this time the red dots representing human forces numbered in the thousands rather than hundreds. The hegemony was completely surrounded by an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't fight, and couldn't escape. "This is impossible," Admiral Vorthak whispered. "Our intelligence networks would have detected fleet movements of this magnitude." "Your intelligence networks have been compromised for centuries," Dr. Reeves explained patiently. "We've been feeding you false information while gathering real intelligence about your capabilities, your strategies, and your weaknesses." The revelation was like a dagger to the heart of hegemony military doctrine. If their intelligence had been compromised for centuries, then every strategic decision they had made could have been influenced by human manipulation. "You've been controlling us," Korthak said, the words carrying the weight of terrible understanding. "Not controlling," Blackwood corrected. "Guiding. We needed you to remain strong enough to be worth conquering, but weak enough to be vulnerable when we returned. It's been a delicate balance, but we've had 800 years to perfect the process." The implications were staggering. Humanity had been manipulating hegemony development for centuries, ensuring that their eventual return would find an enemy that was formidable enough to make victory meaningful, but not so powerful as to be unbeatable. "What happens now?" Admiral Vorthak asked, his voice barely audible. Captain Blackwood was quiet for a long moment, considering her words carefully. "That depends entirely on your choices, Admiral. We didn't return to the galaxy to commit genocide, despite the example your ancestors set for us. We came back to reclaim our place among the stars, and to ensure that what was done to us is never done to anyone else." She paused, allowing hope to creep into the hearts of the listening aliens before continuing. "The Terran Confederation hereby demands the complete dismantlement of the galactic hegemony. All member species will be granted full independence. All colonial territories will be liberated. All military forces will be reduced to system defense levels only." The demands were comprehensive and non-negotiable. The hegemony as it currently existed would cease to exist, replaced by a confederation of independent worlds under human oversight. "And if we refuse?" Korthax asked. "Then we will do to you exactly what you did to us 800 years ago," Blackwood replied, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "The difference is that we have the power to succeed where you ultimately failed." Commander Pike looked up from his tactical display. "Captain, all human vessels report ready status. We're prepared to begin liberation operations on your command." "Liberation operations?" Admiral Vorthak asked. "Every species that the hegemony has conquered or enslaved will be offered immediate independence and protection under Confederation authority," Dr. Reeves explained. "We've been in contact with resistance movements throughout your empire for decades. They're ready to support our intervention." The psychological warfare was complete. The hegemony was surrounded by enemies without and within, facing an enemy that had spent centuries preparing for this exact scenario. "You have one standard day to begin implementation of our demands," Captain Blackwood announced. "Failure to comply will result in direct military action by Confederation forces." Admiral Korhax felt the weight of his civilization's history pressing down on him. One day to dismantle an empire that has existed for over 1,000 years? You managed to destroy our civilization in less time than that, Blackwood replied coldly. Surely you can apply the same efficiency to dismantling your own. The communication channel fell silent as the alien commanders struggled to process the magnitude of their situation. They faced an enemy that possessed superior technology, perfect intelligence about their capabilities, and 8 centuries of carefully planned revenge. Captain, Commander Torres announced, I'm receiving priority communications from Hegemony High Command. They're requesting immediate negotiation protocols. Tell them that Captain Blackwood of the Terran Confederation will meet with their representatives in exactly 12 hours, she replied. The meeting will take place aboard this vessel, and they will come unarmed and alone. The terms were designed to demonstrate humanity's complete confidence in their position. They were inviting their enemies aboard their ship without fear, knowing that their technological superiority made such gestures safe. This is Admiral Cordhax to all Hegemony vessels, the alien commander announced over the fleet communication network. Stand down from combat alert and maintain current positions. Do not engage the human vessel under any circumstances. It was the closest thing to a surrender that had ever been broadcast by a Hegemony fleet commander. Captain Blackwood took one final look at the alien fleet surrounding them. Hundreds of ships that represented the accumulated military might of dozens of species, all rendered impotent by the return of a people they thought they had destroyed forever. The age of the Galactic Hegemony is over, she announced to her crew. The age of the Terran Confederation begins now. As the Retribution prepared to receive the alien delegation that would negotiate the terms of their empire's dissolution, Captain Blackwood reflected on the long journey that had brought humanity back to the stars. They had been driven from their homes as refugees, but they were returning as conquerors. The galaxy would learn that exile had not broken the human spirit, it had forged it into something harder than diamond and sharper than any blade. The children of Earth had come home, and they would never be driven away again. In the depths of space, quantum signals raced between human vessels positioned throughout the galaxy, carrying news of their success to every corner of what had once been Hegemony space. The message was simple, but profound. Humanity had returned, and this time, they were here to stay. The next chapter of galactic history was about to begin, written not by the species that had tried to erase humanity from existence, but by the survivors who had refused to let themselves be forgotten. Justice, 8 centuries in the making, was finally at hand.